Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third in our labor series, Bargaining with Your Employees' Labor Representative, the do's and don'ts of union negotiation. I, again, am Nicole Atala, partner here at the Labor and Employment Group at Blair Mazza, and I'm here with Sarah Nash.
Hi, everyone.
Sarah told me I'm not allowed to make any weird puns about Halloween, so I know this is an intimidating and scary topic. Happy Halloween.
So she ignored everything I said.
But today we're going to talk about what I think is one of the most intimidating parts of working with unions and organized groups of folks, and that's what do you do about negotiations? What to expect when you walk in the room? What types of things do you have to negotiate? What types of things do you not? So we're really going to understand better our obligations to bargain with a bargaining representative, what to say and what not to say, and tips for negotiating a strong agreement.
And Nicole mentioned this is a scary topic. I think one of the reasons it's scary is because you don't necessarily have clear guidelines telling you exactly what you need to be doing when you need to be doing it. And we'll try to kind of go over some of those sort of broader rules that apply. But generally, the obligation that you have when negotiating with a union is that you are required to meet at reasonable times to confer in good faith with a union on mandatory subjects of bargaining. And there's a lot to unpack in that sentence. We'll go over, most of it, we'll go over what a mandatory subject of bargaining is, how you know if employees have designated a bargaining representative, and what it means to bargain in good faith, and in some instances, what it means to bargain in bad faith. And just to start this off, because I think it's one of the bigger issues with when it comes to bargaining, is it can't just be showing up at the table. You have to demonstrate that you are actually interested in reaching an agreement, and you have to actively pursue that agreement in order to ultimately be performing your obligation under the Act.
And in the first webinar, we talked about unfair labor practice charges at the NLRB. And normally one of the first types of charges we get in a negotiating scenario is a failure to negotiate in good faith. And that's one of the tools that a union might use to press you to move forward, because that's generally of little to no cost to them and ends up costing you. So sometimes they have very reasonable things to say about that. And sometimes it's kind of a pressure tactic. It depends on the group, and obviously perspective is important there. But that's all to say that that's one way that you can, quote unquote, get in trouble if you don't engage in good faith bargaining is the ULP.
And it does sound sort of intimidating, but generally, as with most things, if you can have a decent relationship with your union, then you don't have to worry about necessarily crossing all the T's and dotting the I's and making sure that everything's perfect, because we're all human. And so if you could have a decent conversation with people and talk through some of these things, you're not necessarily going to be standing at an unfair labor practice.
Yeah. So when do you have an obligation to bargain? So this is, kind of at the very, very beginning of a process before you're even really sitting down across the table from anyone. A couple of different things can happen that would invoke your obligation to bargain. The first is that there's an election. So you either come into a contract situation if you're a government contractor, or if you're not a government contractor, your labor force decides that they want to be organized, and they go through the election process to vote and certify the union. And there is a specific process that happens and specific timelines. There's some negotiating there with respect to what the proper bargaining unit is, et cetera. But once that's been established and the employees vote, and if they certify that union as their bargaining representative, from that point in time forward, you have an obligation to bargain with that union. Another thing that can happen is that you voluntarily recognize the union. So in a lot of scenarios, maybe you already have a good relationship with a union. You're working on several different contracts with the union. Maybe even you've signed a national agreement that says that you'll voluntarily recognize a union once there's a showing of support. You can it's within your purview to voluntarily recognize and say, hey, we're going to not do this election process and we're going to go forward. And as soon as you do that, then you have an obligation to bargain. Once your collective bargaining agreement expires, you have an obligation to bargain, right? So you've signed a CBA and it has a specific term in it. And those are the rules of the road while that agreement is in place. But almost every agreement has a provision in it that says within so many days of the expiration of this agreement, we're going to give notice to the other party that we want to sit down and talk about these terms again. And when that happens, you have to sit down and talk to them about it. There are certain exceptions here for construction contracts subject to pre-hire agreements.
You kind of have to be in it to know whether it applies to you, but basically certain provisions of the Act allow construction companies in very specific scenarios to enter into what's called a pre-hire agreement, which means that you don't have a showing of union support before you sign an agreement. And so just be wary. If you're in the construction industry, you want to make sure that you understand which requirements apply to you.
We do have a question. Do you always have to renegotiate when an agreement is about to expire? Unless the union's been decertified, generally speaking, if somebody invokes a clause in the contract that says, the contract says within 30 or 60 days, the other party can give notice that they want to sit down and renegotiate, then yes, you would have to sit down and negotiate. Some contracts have provisions in them where they say if no party gives notice, then the agreement will just continue from year to year. Now, it depends on the wage and benefit provisions in those agreements, obviously, as to whether you want to, sit down and talk about these again. But if you have a provision in your contract that just says we're going to do a 2% wage increase every year and everybody's happy, I've had circumstances where nobody touches the agreement because it just continues from year to year until somebody's unhappy. So that can happen as well. But generally speaking, yes, when it's going to expire and somebody gives notice, or does expire, if there's not a notice provision, then you have an obligation to sit down and bargain. And finally, we talked a little bit about this the last two sessions, but if you're performing as a successor in interest, so if you purchase a company that has a bargaining unit on site, there are certain tests to determine if you are a successor in interest. That goes back to that concept of whether you're a perfectly clear successor as well and what terms and conditions you need to invoke for employment at the outset. But in both of those scenarios, whether you're taking over a government contract where there's a labor union or the employees have already been organized, you take on a workforce and you hire more than 50% of the people that are in a bargaining unit, or you are a perfectly clear successor, or you purchase a company, in those scenarios, you would likely be a successor in interest and need to negotiate with the union.
So next, we're going to discuss a little bit about what these negotiations should cover. And it's important to understand the difference between mandatory subjects of bargaining and what are known as permissive or voluntary subjects of bargaining. So mandatory subjects of bargaining are subjects that directly impact employees' terms and conditions of employment. And these are topics that you need to negotiate. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to negotiate them in a certain way or that you have to reach a certain conclusion when you're talking about these provisions, but you can't just flat out say, oh no, we're not going to talk about that. Examples of mandatory subjects would include wages, benefits, holidays, sick days, general sort of terms that govern the nature of employees. And you can negotiate sort of limited types of implementing these issues. So, for example, if you don't want to necessarily provide sick days, that doesn't mean you have to provide them, but you do have to negotiate over them. And it'll make sense a little bit more as we talk on the next slide about what you don't necessarily have to talk about, but there have been unfair labor practices filed where employers have refused, or unions even, it's both parties have an obligation to talk about these issues. So you want to make sure that you're not shutting down negotiations when it comes to terms and conditions of employees' employment.
And one thing I'll say is, when you're getting ready, just from a practical what happens next. So when we started out talking about when you have to sit down and actually negotiate or when you have to negotiate with a labor union, right? So there's that question, but then I always get the question as to, okay, well, what happens in that space between I recognize that I have to negotiate with them and then I'm deciding what pieces I need to negotiate? What are my mandatory subjects? What am I going to suggest we put in this agreement? Usually some sort of phone call is made. Somebody writes you a letter. A lot of times you'll receive a form letter from the union saying, this is our information request. We talked about information requests in the first session and what you're obligated to provide. Look over those carefully. They're usually a form letter that goes out from the union that says, this is all the stuff we normally ask for. If you're concerned about it, call us and we can talk you through whether you have to provide that information or not. They're trying to get a sense of what you currently provide and what your current policies are so that they can make recommendations to their unit as to what to bargain over and trying to figure out what their unit wants and how realistic that is, right? So they're doing that. And then there's a question over time and place. When are we going to sit down? Sometimes, if you're a government contractor, you'll say, we have 9-10 months before we have to turn something into the CO. We talked to last week, remember, that doesn't mean you have 9-10 months under the NLRA to sit down and talk to the union. So I'd suggest these things can take longer than you expect. So I would suggest that you do that. Start having those initial conversations on the front end of that year as opposed to the back end. Don't push it too far off. And then there's a question of, can't we do this by telephone? Where do we have to do this? Particularly if you have a work site that's far away from your home office, there's a cost to going out there. All of that is negotiable. Some unions are perfectly fine talking about initial drafts and things like that over the phone until you get to the heavy stuff. Other unions are not okay with that, and particularly if you don't have a relationship yet, they want to sit down at the table. I've gone through this question at the NLRB before, whether we can force them to do this on the phone, and most of the time they'll say, if in doubt, we're going to make you go to the location of the employees so that the employees can be involved in bargaining. But that's a case-by-case decision. So once you guys all agree on time and place and number of days, not uncommon for the union to ask for 5 consecutive bargaining days the first time around. And employers always say, wait a second, Nicole, I don't have 5 days to sit down. Maybe you get done sooner, but that's all negotiable. The number of days, where you meet, where you sit down. Is it going to be at the union hall? Is it going to be at the company location? Is it going to be a neutral territory? All of that should be talked about beforehand, as well as how you're going to handle some of these mandatory and permissive subjects of bargaining. So what are we going to tackle first? What issues are we going to talk about first? Do you want us to look at some agreement that you like? So unions will often say, hey, we really like this agreement, or this is the predecessor agreement. We'd like to start from here. So all of those kinds of pre-negotiation issues you want to talk about first. We always recommend starting with non-economic terms first and then getting to the economic stuff, because that's usually where it can get a little bit tense. And so we recommend kind of separating those things out, getting stuff checked off as you go, and then talking about these things. So let's talk about permissive subjects of bargaining for a minute. So what types of things may you talk about, but you don't necessarily have to talk about. They're not directly related to terms of employment, so they're not wages or vacation or holidays, but they're important. They're often very important things to the unit, right? They're often things that, you might think, why do you care about that? But the unit cares about that, those types of things. So examples would be, again, terms of negotiations, which I think is really important, but it's not required. Adding supervisors, that comes up a lot, particularly on government contracts, because if a project manager or a lead of some sort was in the unit under the prior contractor, they might be in a position to lose some of their benefits by coming, to you. So there might be a discussion about whether there's some way to let them keep their benefits, but maybe not be subject to the disciplinary provisions or things like that. There might be terms about how they can access the site, when the union can access the site. Those things might come up as, they're kind of gray areas with respect to whether you have to talk about them or not. Some things are just good practice to talk about, even if they're not mandatory. What I usually suggest, if the union raises an issue or you raise an issue that the other party doesn't want to talk about, you at least talk about why it is that you don't want to talk about it. Or you say, I don't think it's appropriate to put this very long, drawn out thing in the CBA, but I'm willing to talk to you about how we handle these situations or what the company's position is on it. I just don't know that it's something appropriate for the CBA.
Something else that you want to be careful about is because these are permissive and because you're not required to bargain over them, you're also not required to essentially hitch your horse on mandatory subjects to your permissive subjects. So if you can't necessarily agree on how many negotiating sessions you want to have in the first go around or when and where you want to meet, you can't condition reaching agreement on everything else on meeting that permissive subject of bargaining. So that's just something to keep in the back of your head.
Yeah, so you can't say, I'm not going to agree to your wage proposal if you don't agree to my proposal to meet for 3 days instead of 5. Or something like that, because that essentially invokes a mandatory subject of bargaining. That's essentially what it does. This is all distinguished from illegal subjects of bargaining, such as like that we talked about what a closed shop provision is, or hiring hall provision with preference for union members, provisions inconsistent with the union's duty of fair representation. So things that are protected by law, you're not going to be able to bargain over those things because they're protected essentially by law. The law tells us how to deal with those things as opposed to something that can really be negotiated over.
And so now that we know sort of the different types of things that might come up, we'll go over some important things that you are definitely going to want to include in a CBA. There's a lot on this list. I think I'm going to just cherry pick a few. Nicole might have a few that she wants to talk about as well. Generally, these are sort of the typical things you would see. Union recognition essentially determines your bargaining unit and how you recognize the union and what it applies to, so what your agreement is looking at. And then something that is pretty important, but it's sort of confusing, so it's maybe outside the scope of this presentation, is union security and membership. And there's a big difference in how this operates, whether you're in a right-to-work state or if you're in a non-right-to-work state. But generally, this is going to determine union dues and how you go about deducting those employees' paychecks and membership. And so this is something that the union is going to likely insist be in an agreement. It's important to look at it to make sure it's not obligating you to any unlawful terms. But generally, it's going to be in there. And you want to make sure generally that there's an indemnification clause that goes along with it, just because it's putting you in a situation where you're likely going to be taking out or deducting dues from employees' paychecks. So that's something to consider. Generally, when you talk about CBAs, the big ticket item is this idea of discipline and just cause. And discipline kind of goes hand in hand with grievance and arbitration procedures. And that's because generally one of the biggest benefits that employees get from having a collective bargaining agreement is this idea that they can't be terminated for any reason. So they're no longer at will. They're likely going to only be able to be terminated for just cause. And there's a lot of ways to sort of set this up. I'd say probably the most frequent one that we see involves a sort of progressive discipline where you maybe might include a verbal warning followed by a written warning, followed by potential final warning or suspension, and then ultimately termination. And there are a lot of different ways you can set this up, but it's going to be important that you address this in a CBA. And on the other side of that, if for some reason someone is disciplined or terminated, you will have a grievance procedure that you can follow for figuring out how the union and the company go about sort of addressing a problem that arises if an employee is terminated.
And in that, the types of employees that you have really matter. So we see the more extensive discipline policies with workforces that, I don't want to say sometimes they're lower skilled workers. Sometimes they have more shift work. It's easier to kind of sets very specific rules of the road with respect to what's allowed and what's not allowed. But sometimes we see something that's just, we won't discipline or terminate without just cause. Sometimes there's just a very slight reference to it in a management rights provision or something like that.
Yeah. And then some other important provisions. This is by no means all inclusive. So be sure maybe to look at a model when you're actually going through the motions of this. But one thing that you want to make sure is in there is a no strike, no lockout provision. And a strike is essentially where workers can get together and say, we disagree with whatever's going on here, and we want to strike, and which is generally something that's protected by the National Labor Relations Act, but you are able to contract around it by saying, in exchange essentially for reaching this agreement and getting together, we're going to agree that employees are not allowed to strike during the terms of the CBA. And it works both ways. So just as employees have the ability to strike in most instances, employers also have the ability to lock out employees, which can be used essentially as a technique to kind of encourage negotiations or to encourage different sort of processes when you're working through different relations with unions. And so it's important to have those provisions in there, especially when you're in the government contracting world, because you don't want to be in a situation where all of a sudden your entire workforce is out with less than a day's notice and you're scrambling to fill in those positions. You want some sort of labor peace to be assured. And so pretty much most CBAs, you're going to see a no strike, no lockout provision. You also want a management rights provision, which is going to essentially define the things that are outside of the scope of the CBA that say, listen, this is management's sort of purview. So they can set hours of employment. They can set when we want to lay off employees. Suppose you have a slump in work and you need to maybe lay off some people who you don't necessarily have the work for. You want to consider what sort of things might come up in the day-to-day sort of scope of the business that have ultimately a hard impact on the bottom line. Another thing that it's not always in CBAs, but you might consider whether or not you want to include it. It's called a zipper clause. Essentially what it does is it says everything that we've talked about in this CBA is what it is. And we're not addressing things that are outside of the CBA. It kind of zips out the possibility of things that are outside the scope coming up later. And it can be useful if you don't want to operate in a lot of gray area. And then lastly, just because we have a lot of government contractors listening in, we generally recommend including a government requirements section that essentially says if the government makes us do something, then we have to be able to do it. And that you might think, oh, that makes perfect sense. That should be how it works all the way. But if you don't have that provision in there necessarily, it could get messy when you're negotiating down the line or when you're trying to, suppose the government strips someone of their credentials to get into a work site.
Or shuts down the government.
Or shuts down the government.
Yeah.
If there's nothing in your agreement that specifically addresses this kind of idea that there is a government customer out there, you could be stuck on the line and ultimately unable to get out of it from a contractual perspective. There's also, we've talked about this in the previous webinars, so I'll just mention it briefly, this idea of withdrawal liability and potentially making sure that you are potentially covered from a price adjustment standpoint when it comes to pension withdrawal liability. So these are just some things to think about. If you have particular questions about them, we can go over them at another time, but that's just generally what you want to think about. We have one question about sort of what would happen if you accidentally agree to something not allowed by law. Technically, it's a violation of the act. It could be a ULP.
Usually it doesn't happen that way.
Yeah,
usually it's just void.
If there's no one to really, if there's no one to complain about it, it's probably not going to end up anywhere. It'll just get stricken.
Yeah, we just say it's void as a matter of law, that we couldn't have agreed to it by contract, and then you deal with it when it comes up. And that happens, all the time. There are non-discrimination provisions that aren't complete depending on the state that you're in. Or we run across things that are technically illegal in agreements all the time. And you just talk to the union and say, oops, and we move on. So sometimes we get stumped, particularly on things like wages or how much vacation accrual someone's going to get, or whether or not you're going to agree to be in healthcare, in the union's healthcare plan, or whether or not you're going to agree to that pension plan. And so there's this concept in bargaining that once you get to impasse, it's called legal impasse, then you as an employer can implement your last best offer doesn't necessarily, negate some of your other responsibilities, but it basically says at some point in time that duty to bargain is suspended, and we've got to move on with our lives, right? What I will caution you about is that legal impasse is extremely difficult to get to. Just because you don't agree in one meeting doesn't mean you're at legal impasse, and I would highly suggest you talk to counsel before just saying, okay, well, you're going to take our terms and we're just going to go about our way. It also, for government contractors, remember, in order to get those price adjustments, you need to have a signed, sealed, and delivered agreement. So this is not going to help you get there, right? It's unlawful to reach impasses on those illegal or permissive subjects of bargaining because they're not required anyway, right? So somebody can bypass them. I've also had situations where essentially the board has said you've essentially come to an agreement to terms, and those outliers, they don't matter. You've essentially come to an agreement on all the important stuff. And so does this happen? Yes, but it's extremely difficult to get there.
So those are sort of the basic bones of how you come to an agreement. There are some other important things that we're going to touch on this slide, just because it's important that you're not blindsided and that you understand at least that they're coming and you don't outright like engage or reject these issues. So Nicole touched on this earlier, and it's this idea of both parties have a duty to furnish relevant information. So when the union sends you that information request, you have an obligation to respond to it. And it's important that you don't delay, because failure to respond in some cases is just as detrimental as delay, and delay is detrimental as failure to respond. So you don't want to be dragging your feet. Sometimes you might have an argument that it's confidential information or it's proprietary. You really need to look at it. The general rule of thumb, though, is that most things are relevant as long as it's touching on employees and their rates of pay or their benefits, or specifically that workforce. Chances are you have an obligation to turn it over. So there's this interesting sort of part to the law that requires that you provide financial information where an employer has stated that it is financially unable to pay the wages or the benefits that the union's asking for.
So you're sitting down and you say, we can't afford to give you a $3 an hour raise. Mm-hmm. You just basically open the door to the union requesting financial information to demonstrate that you can't afford it.
Exactly.
And you never want to put yourself in those positions. So it's a good idea before you go into a bargaining room to make sure that the team that you've selected, that there's a spokesperson that understands the rules of the road. We bargain a lot on behalf of clients, and it's not always necessary to have us there. A lot of times, some clients do it on their own. Some clients have us go and do it for them. It just depends on where you are in the process. But at very least, you should make sure that the person that's designated to speak on behalf of the company knows when they could be getting in trouble if they say something out of turn.
Yeah, and it's not so just because you're unable, you want to say this isn't going to make us uncompetitive or this isn't practical, that doesn't necessarily open up, but just be careful when you're talking about money in those terms. You also want to make sure that the person that you designate has adequate authority to negotiate. You don't want to be in a situation where every time you go over something, they have to go and make a phone call to the actual person who's in charge. That doesn't mean that they ultimately have to have the authority to sign off on the final agreement, but they need to be able to make substantive changes. Otherwise, you're opening yourself to a bad faith bargaining claim.
And in fact, I think everybody recognizes that the union even has obligations to make sure they run the final proposed agreement past their workforce. A lot of times there are voting procedures. You might have a CEO that you need to run it by just to make sure that you get the final signed, sealed, and delivered. You want to make sure that you have conveyed to the union on every single draft that, we're not agreeing to a whole CBA, even if we agree to pieces of it until we sign on the dotted line. So before you walk into a room, again, it's important to understand what processes you're going to employ to make sure nobody misunderstands what their obligations are.
Mm-hmm. And just quickly, it's unlawful to, so sort of a big topic, but just bear in mind, you can't be changing terms and conditions of employment while you're engaged in negotiations.
So you can't give everybody a big bonus or change their wages right when you're in the middle of negotiations. You can't do that.
Yeah, you're trapped in a holding pattern to a certain extent. You can't bargain directly with employees, to Nicole's point of bonuses. You can't say, hey, Joe, what do you think about a bonus for Christmas? And we'll figure it out that way. The idea is that you're not necessarily treating the union in that instance as the employee's collective bargaining agent. You're going around them, and it's called direct dealing, and it's unlawful under the Act. You also can't, Nicole spoke about this, withdraw from an agreed upon provision. So you want to be careful that you're accurately describing to what extent you're agreeing. If you have a tentative agreement, it's better to put it that way than to say, yes, we agree, because you don't want to have to go back to it and essentially engage in regressive bargaining.
And a lot of times when you go through it, and I know we're running a little over, but I promise we have one slide left, so bear with us for a minute. A lot of times what you do when you go through is you mark TAs by things that the union or the employer have tentatively agreed to.
Mm-hmm. And then lastly, you can't, this is sort of after you bargain, after you've gotten a CBA, just be aware that you're going to be stuck with those terms unless you essentially get the union's prior consent to be able to change them, which is a whole different kind of kettle of worms. So just be aware that these are, at least for the term that you've agreed to, which is generally, 3 to 4 years, these are going to be the terms that pending some sort of unforeseen circumstance, these are the terms of employment.
So final tips for productive bargaining, kind of know the rules of the road. As I said, plan on how you are going to approach bargaining, what's really important to you. Have you talked about what your bargaining position has to be or what your limitations are? Don't go in blind. It's always good if you take the initiative by providing a proposal at the first meeting. You always want to be the one to first propose, and that, so when I talk about the union will often send you an agreement that they really like. I don't like to put it in the same form. Sometimes I like to use I like to take pieces out because it's always good if employees recognize certain language. But, take initiative by providing a proposal at the first meeting on certain terms. You can always turn it into the CBA language later. Take very good detailed notes about who's saying what, when things are agreed to, when things are tentatively agreed to, what's said, so that if there's any dispute later, you know about it. Do your homework, know what you're getting into, know what's important to the union. You can often find agreements of theirs online. There's a lot of information out there, so you can get a sense of what they've agreed to in the past. And sometimes we'll find agreements that were like, oh, over here, they didn't require health care. So what they're telling me and bargaining about, they always have to have their health care plan, is just not true. So do that homework and never engage in regressive bargaining. And that means that we've tentatively agreed to $15 an hour, and now as basically a punitive measure, I'm going to say now I'm only going to agree to 10. There may be some shuffling around there at the end where you say, okay, you guys want 2 more days of vacation. That means you're going to get a little bit less in wages. That's not necessarily regressive. What's regressive is if you say, oh, sorry, we didn't get that wrapped up the last time, so now it's whatever it is. And so you have to be careful again that when you're agreeing to things, you're careful about the language that you're using. Thank you. I know we went over today, so I really appreciate your attention. I know it's hard on an afternoon, especially on Halloween. I hope you all have a great night. And thank you so much for joining us for the 3-part series. All of the materials are on the web, and we really do appreciate feedback. So if there's anything we didn't cover that you want to hear about, please let us know.
Thanks.